Welcome everyone to another edition of NatCon Australia. Today I'm delighted to welcome William Coleman. William Coleman is a well-known Australian academic and reader in the School of Economics at the Australian National University. He's published widely in the field of history of economic thought and contemporary economic controversies. He's the prize-winning author or co-author or editor of numerous books, most recently Their Fiery Cross of Union, a retelling of the creation of the Australian Federation. Welcome, William. Is there anything else I should have added to your bio?
No, that's very generous, and thank you, Dan. But just for the record, I retired from the Australian National University, and I'm now an adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. Just so there's no confusion.
Got it.
There.
Got it. But you're still based in Canberra, right? Or you're based in Perth?
No, I now live on the north coast of New South Wales.
North coast of New South Wales. Sorry, got it. Yeah. So let's get straight into it. I mean, I have enjoyed all your books. They're full of interesting detail about Australian history. And the latest one focuses on federation, the Australian Federation. And one of your key points is that a genuine federation, as distinct from a faux federation of unification, may have served Australia well. But the flaw of the Federation of 1901 is that it was a botched federation and may have precluded a better one. What would your ideal Australian Federation have looked like?
Look, there are a number of alternative paths which Australia could have followed. It could have taken the Federal Council of Australasia and added an elective assembly to it and left the council itself, essentially a Premier's Conference. That would have produced a kind of confederal Australia, which I think would have served Australia best. Alternatively, it could have produced a constitution not entirely different from the present constitution, but with the functions of the federal government radically scaled back to defence and foreign affairs, and possibly an internal free trade, with the expectation and provision that further functions could be added over time after appropriate consultation with the people. I think there are deeper flaws, though, in the Constitution itself, though I'm a great believer in the House of Review. I think that Australia's Senate is the most powerful Senate in the world of any parliamentary system. It is too powerful. And I think there are various other quirks and crotchets in the Constitution, which would have been avoided if, as an alternative, Australia had proceeded to a closer political integration in a more, if you like, ad hoc manner, rather than with this great constitution which will last 1,000 years thunderclap. I think we would have got a more adaptive, more practical mechanism rather than this sort of marble palace which has been imposed on us over the years.
Doesn't your point of view mirror a bit the anti-federalists in the United States, right, who wanted to maintain the Articles of Confederacy in a looser association governing those United States? And then, people like Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and Pitt in the Federalist Papers ultimately prevailed because it was necessary for that new nation to survive, to have a tighter, more compact constitution and central government. Are you not only critical of the Australian Federation, but also critical of the US one as well? I'm just trying to work out where you would fall.
I think there are circumstances that differ profoundly from century to century and from society to society. I don't need to advance a universal proposition about the benefits or failures of central government. I think that's such a proposition would be impossible to be true universally. I would only emphasize that in what both those possibilities I mentioned, in both, there would have been a central organ of government but it would have been for respect to Australia. But it would have with an executive, and that, of course, is completely different from the Articles of Confederation, which completely lacked of 17, whatever it was, during the Revolutionary War, which completely lacked
Yeah.
an executive, and which made really imperative the Constitution of 1788, 1787 of the Americans.
But doesn't your analysis in some way downplay what could have gone wrong in Australia but didn't? You know, we did in the end do it peacefully. We didn't split the country. We didn't lose Western Australia or Northern Australia. We didn't make it too big to include places like New Zealand or the Pacific Islands. We passed a constitution which has governed one of the most stable democracies in the world and survived the 20th century when many other countries didn't. So isn't that proof, in a sense, that while you can quibble about some of the flaws or ways in which it might be improved, that it was a success?
Well, I guess it's success relative to the counterfactual, and we'll never know the
Mm.
counterfactual. But I would argue that Western Australia was very badly damaged by being roped in, essentially, um, to the the Commonwealth of Australia. It would have been much better if it had gone through this dramatic transition it was in the midst of between 1890 and 1920. It's much better if it had gone in on its own terms, gone through that, and then entered the Commonwealth more on its own terms, rather than entering as a small minority and becoming a small player in a drama of which was scripted entirely by others. So I don't think the Western Australia serves your example at all. And as we all know, Western Australia remains highly discontented with the Commonwealth, though it never really wants to leave it, of course. But it would have been happier if it had come in later on its own terms, I believe. As for stability, which is your other wrong point, well, Australia is not a country which really has the kind of threats and pressures which most other countries have. So I'm unimpressed by the stability. I believe in the counterfactual we would have been stable. The two counterfactuals I offered up, we would have been stable anyway, possibly more stable.
Yeah. So what, when you talk about Western Australia joining on more favourable terms, what would they have looked like? I mean, they get a great, at the moment, they get a great GST, slice of the GST revenue, which they're very reluctant to change. I mean, what would they have,
Well,
should they have got, or could they have got, you think, that they haven't got now?
well, essentially, the Federation was an oppressive deal for them at one stage, and I believe quite bogus invocation of the Constitution. Transport of people to Western Australia was completely monopolised by various organs of the federal government, in particular the railways. They, of course, suffered from the tariff barrier, which was immediately erected, almost immediately erected, by the federal parliament. There was nothing in it for them, for these high tariffs on manufacturers. And then the industrial relations, right? Again, industrial relations is really born from Melbourne, the centre of Melbourne almost. That they would not have been encumbered, I believe, to the same degree if they had gone in on their own terms. They would have provided a competitor, Australia. This is important too, and that would have been value.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out how a better federation would have, in practice, come to be. I think you mentioned in your book saying that it might have been better if it had happened after the First World War, but I wasn't entirely sure. You know, in that volatile post-war situation, what sort of arrangement she would have got. I mean, wasn't it be better that we sort of did form it in relative peacetime in 1900 rather than
I think, I
afterwards?
think, I think our land forces were very much damaged by Federation. Um, it's different with the Navy. The Blue Water Navy is something which is very expensive, and a Federation, indeed prior to World War One, that was the one useful thing about the what I'd call a premature Federation, the creation of a Blue Water Navy just on the verge of the First World War. But I hasten to say, if I may maintain my severity with respect to Federation, there was no essential connection between a Blue Water Navy and Federation. On the contrary, Barton and his defence minister, Forrest, expressly said in the first federal government that we will have no Australian Navy. It was Deakin later on who pursued the naval project. So there was no essential connection between Federation and a Blue Water Navy, though I concede Federation being around in 1910, it did make for a relatively quick and easy construction of this valuable thing. Otherwise, though, it damaged Australia's land forces, I believe. My argument is for World War One is that the pressure from Britain to Australia at the outbreak of war, if Australia had not federate, would have been so great to coordinate. There would have been something quickly thrown up, some mechanism of coordination, and that mechanism would have been dictated by the needs of the day, right? If you like, expedience. And that would have been a far more flexible thing, far more responsive to practicalities than I say the present day constitution. That's why I think wartime could have been a good catalyst for a closer political integration rather than these sort of dreamy peacetime fantasies.
Yeah, but except you never know how it would turn out. It may have been put together in a hurry because of wartime
We'll never know.
requirements. And yeah, on the Constitution itself, I mean, what is wrong with our Constitution? Isn't it something that Alexander Hamilton would have been happy to sign? Aren't you looking also in the same way overlooking what could have gone wrong? We could have introduced proportional representation like other countries. We didn't introduce a Bill of Rights like Alexander Hamilton was against, but and that it would have had problems, I think, even though the Americans like it. And federalism was a tough nut to, it's a tough nut anywhere to introduce properly, right? So didn't we make the best of it? And why be so down on our Constitution? What's particularly wrong with it?
Because, firstly, it's there are various flaws. It's a bit hard to order them. The first flaw is that we took an American Senate and just unimaginatively bolted it on top of a British lower house. This blurs who the ministry is responsible to. Of course, by massive British precedent, the ministry, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet is responsible to the lower house. But it nowhere says that in the Constitution. Nowhere. And this was by design. It's not as if everybody agreed, oh, yes, we know. Sort of don't need to state it. Of course, the minister is responsible to the House of Representatives. No, by design, it was left unclear. In fact, given the powerfulness of the Senate, it is unclear, as events of 1975, the disastrous events of 1975 demonstrated. It's just not quite clear who creates the executive. Is it simply the House of Representatives, or is the Senate somehow involved? That's a major architectural flaw, a sort of clicking time bomb, which blew up in 1975 and may yet again. Another fundamental flaw is that all power of is that the central government, namely the Commonwealth government, controls the Constitution, if I could put it that way. Only the central government, the Commonwealth government, indeed the House of Representatives specifically, can initiate referenda. There is no power of the states to referenda. The Court of Constitutional Review, the High Court, is entirely the creature of the Commonwealth government. And it's because the Commonwealth government controls the Constitution that we now have facade federalism, right? I mean, it's just a facade. I mean, with some gaping exceptions, it's a facade. The states are municipal institutions, I mean, with one or two important exceptions. Now, a genuine federalism would have the Constitution shared between the local powers and the central powers. They would share appointments to the Court of Constitutional Review. They would both have the power to initiate referendums. So really, that asymmetry in the or the location of the ownership of the Constitution in the central government destined Australia's federalism to perish and become what we have.
But who has done federalism well in the New World, English-speaking countries? Look, because really, yeah.
Canada, I believe.
I mean, New Zealand doesn't have. Yeah.
Well,
and
New Zealand,
Canada's the best, you think?
It had a federal system which was abolished around 1870 for a central system. But Canada, I think, it should be, if we want a sort of practical model, it would be Canada, which ironically enough, in a black letter law term, has a more centralist constitution than we do in a black letter law sense. But it's interesting. Sort of somehow realities have intruded. There are various other theories why Canada has a more genuine federalism. Yes, but Canada would be the model of a more confederal system, which I'm sure would be much better for Australia.
I mean, they had the Quebecois, the French-speaking minority in province.
Yeah.
So that's something we never had to deal with. But I don't know. I mean, look, in the grand scheme of things, is Canada really that better managed than Australia because of its preferred constitutional arrangement? Your preferred constitutional arrangements? I don't know.
It's difficult. It's difficult to. I think in matters of higher education, for example, education in general, the Commonwealth powers has been catastrophic. I mean, this national schools curriculum. What an agony. I mean, whatever it touches, it seems to me, the Commonwealth government just ruins. Canada's education system is not based on what the late Max Corden called what do you call it? Moscow on the Molonglo, just sending out directives in all directions. And it's far worse now than when Max did many years ago. So I just mentioned education because that's something I know a bit about. So I think in education that they do it better. The Canadians just have a more confederal sense of provinces cooperating with one another. We never get this. We never get a cooperation. What we do is just the states playing Simon Says with Canberra. So I think it's just a regimented and more, and as I say, non-federal system.
Yeah, is that the fault though of the Constitution, or is that just the natural tendency amongst all countries in the Western world to have increasing power vested in the?
Well, again, Canada would be you can advance a kind of iron law of centralism. Of course, it may be the case that centralism is destructive, but a realist might say, "Oh well, we can't do anything about it. It's destructive, but we can't do anything about it." Well, you can advance that position. But again, I think Canada is a counter example of a sort of iron law of centralization.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things I think that yourself and many of my other liberal think tank market buddies sort of miss is that it wasn't just Australia and it wasn't just Victoria that in the lead up to federation were very pro tariffs and very pro restrictionist immigration policies, right? And I sort of sometimes feel that both federation and the so-called Australian settlement are a disappointment to liberal market people. That's your view, right?
Well, they're a nightmare.
Yeah, but
it's a nightmare.
But don't, sorry, go on.
Well, redundant and destructive.
But isn't there an argument though that if Australia had not introduced, let's handle each of them in turn. If we had not introduced a very restrictive immigration policy in 1900, that we would have turned out a very different country, and we may not have ended up as a harmonious one, which was able to, by the the late 70s, happily accommodate people from different countries. Because there's a lot of parts of the world that are riven by ethnic kind of conflict, and we were able to avoid that in the 20th century.
I guess the first point I'd make in response is that Australia before Federation already had quite restrictive policies on Asian immigration, Chinese Immigration Acts, right? Essentially organised by Henry Parkes, New South Wales, Victoria, they all had them. What Federation did was just make a policy going from strong to really brutally severe, sort of total exclusion, almost fanatical policy. But the Chinese Immigration Restriction Acts of the late 1880s had really wound back Chinese immigration. I think that's the first point to realise. A similar point is that in Queensland, the laws had already stopped the emigration of Kanakas from the Southwest Pacific to Australia. What Federation did was deport the Kanakas, right? I mean, I think that was really quite a redundant thing, quite brutal, quite full of political injustice, given that to these people. I think if the existent Kanaka population had remained, that could have been, if you want to speculate, a kind of bridge to the Southwest Pacific, which would have been fortunate for Australia's security. So there's some sort of historical points. Federation was just fanaticizing, really exaggerating to a severity, which an unnecessary severity, what had already been the tendency of policy. But I want to make a different point. I want to say that Australian tolerance, which you invoke from the 1970s onwards, is rooted in liberalism, right? And Federation was just so anti-liberal. It was intolerant. It was something which Australia had to get over. It was a diversion from our British inheritance, and it was something we had to go through and just discover that it was so maladaptive and redundant. So, at what tolerance?
Isn't the reason why?
No, go on. Go. Sorry.
Yeah, go. I was just going to say, like, I mean, I think you can contest that, right? I mean, whether our tolerance was really the product of an ideology, liberalism, or whether it was because of the very homogenous society which had been created, that we weren't beset by ethnic conflict, so that we were able to be broad, accept further immigrations later on. Because when you look around the world, people can read books on liberalism and this, that, and the other, but if they have their countries which are divided along ethnic lines, it becomes an intractable problem, and we were fortunately able to avoid that. Like I said, for most of the 20th century. So
I'm puzzled by your presentation of, shall we say, pre-1960s Australia. Pre-1960s Australia was cursed by religious sectarianism. Okay, it was just plagued by this thing. I wouldn't blame religious sectarianism on federation as such, though in my book I argue it might have just indirectly inflamed it somewhat. But religious sectarianism was just so deep into a Australian life, permeating all sorts of things like sports, wherever you went, wherever you looked. So no, I don't see that pre-1960s period as just a sunny and happy, easy population. I don't see that
Yeah,
at all.
I don't. Oh, I have Irish heritage. I don't deny that existed, but it was on of a completely different type and scale to that which existed in other parts of the world. And I think at some level, whatever religious sectarian differences existed, there was still a sense that everyone was Australian, if not Australian Britain, Australian Irish, or all this, that, and the other. But they would have thought of themselves as Australian rather than,
Well, people have
you know,
been using the Australian identity since at
mm,
least the 1830s, right?
mm,
And possibly even earlier. So I don't think the Australian identity, the idea that you could say, "Oh, well, I'm an Australian," is an invention of federation at all. In fact, I think federation actually harmed the sense of Australian identity. Though that's perhaps leading off our immediate
mm.
topic. Your point was that um, I guess your point was that it wasn't as, if you think of say religious sectarianism, it wasn't as bad as some other um, ethnic or quasi-ethnic divisions elsewhere in the world. Agreed, but circumstances are just so different. My claim would be that liberal Australia was severely damaged by federation. Um, and I think there would have been some collateral damage there was some collateral damage in religious sectarianism of
What do
that.
you make? What do you make, William, though, of the fact that all the New World Anglo democracies
Yeah.
tended to come to the same conclusion with respect to restricting immigration at that time? It wasn't just sort of an Australian, phenomenon.
Well, again,
Surely they can't have all.
you have to distinguish between restricting immigration, particularly from Asia, which Britain never did, but it did have, uh, but the United States certainly did, and the Federation,
Yeah,
the
so to
Immigration
yeah.
Act 1901. The Americans and the Australians, the Americans had very similar law to the Australians. They were based on
Mm,
restricting the numbers of Chinese. I've got sort of no problem with that in a sense. What I have a problem is just the severity of the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, which was just an outright ban. I mean, that's just uselessly and brutally and cruelly severe. I think if we had a more relaxed, slightly more relaxed act, we could have developed more useful ties with Hong Kong and Singapore, which would have aided our security in subsequent years.
mm. Yeah, but it's not in a sense. I feel like sometimes we beat ourselves up about so-called white Australia, but immigration policies today across Asia, in Japan, for example, we don't refer to Japan's immigration policy as yellow Japan policy, but it's as restrictive about
Well, again,
who
I
can
can't
become Japanese as
I can't speak for what's good for Japanese society.
yeah.
It's by our standards, it's a very peculiar
Mm,
society. I do believe that Australia would have been aided by a less severe, as I say, less extreme, less brutal immigration act than the one which prevailed. That's all I'm saying. In the book, I don't, I don't, I don't express any abstract opposition to some sort of ethnic-based immigration policy. I have no
Mm,
abstract opposition to that. I just believe that the new Commonwealth government badly overdid it.
mm. Yeah, that's fair enough. It's sort of hard because you are trying to run a counterfactual. What would Australia have looked like
Yeah,
if it
yeah.
had been less strict or no restrictions or so it's something that one can speculate about. On trade, again, I think you or others have said Federation was essentially a takeover of Australia by the Victorians, who were very protectionist in nature, right?
They
That's what the
do
federal
make a
parliament was.
provocative remark to that effect. Yes, yes, at one point.
Yeah,
I don't express it,
but
but
it's
yeah.
and I'm a Queenslander, and God bless the
Mm,
Victorians and all the rest
mm.
that I've known them over the years. Um, but Victoria wasn't again. It wasn't alone in the Anglo English speaking world in adopting um, restricted trade policies too. So it's not. Were they all?
But
Was Canada wrong? Was
I'm not
Abraham
very
Lincoln
sure
wrong? Were the
well,
New Zealanders wrong?
Canada, hang on, I think Canada sought some sort of, I don't think, some sort of agreements with the United States, right? So I don't think it's a bit harder to compare Canada with Australia there. Certainly, protection was on the march throughout the world. Is that a good thing? Does the fact that it's on the march throughout the world um, justify? I mean, later on, fascism or communism was on the march throughout the world. Is that a good thing?
Mm.
Just because it seems to be everywhere? So I
No, but
I I think I think Australia, in a different history, Australia could have been quite different. Don't forget that George Reed's Customs Act was it in 1896 ordained by the year 1900 the complete abolition in New South Wales of all tariffs, save those on tobacco and alcohol and opium. I mean, essentially everything. So there could have been a different history. It could have been a New South Wales as a free trade economy, but it was not to be.
do you think that we would have had any sort of the same type of significant industrial sector that we had developed by
Well,
the
well,
1960s if we had adopted a free trade regime from 1900?
industrialization is a natural process. Um, Australia's lands had been occupied, right? Technical innovation was massively reducing the demand for labour with fencing, um, with um, tractors, um, steam harvesters, and so on. Don't forget the harvester decision down in Victoria, so central to Australia's Arbitration Commission. What was he doing? He was making agricultural machines, right? And of course, that was a piece of manufacturing. But my point was the agricultural sector will contract at the same time. Capital grows. Where's it going to go? It goes into the next most useful thing, which is manufacturing. So there would have been a natural process of industrialization, which would have been far more beneficial, but it would have occurred at its own speed. Attempts to force feed industrialization didn't work. Steel is a good example. There are attempts to hothouse the steel industry early after Federation. Nothing really happened to the 1930s when it sort of took off. The time was right. So my contention to you is that yes, we would have industrialized, but we probably would have industrialized somewhat less. And I think that would have been to the benefit of most of Australia. This sort of degree of forced industrialisation was without doubt beneficial to Victoria, which benefited from the high price of the manufactures which it exported to the four of the smaller states. But that degree of forced industrialisation was undoubtedly harmful to those four smaller states, paying higher prices than they would have needed otherwise under a free trade regimen. So, in other words, it was winners and losers situation rather than just a winners situation.
Yeah. Look, today Australia has a free trade agreement with China, and essentially 100% of Chinese manufactured goods can come in here duty free. I'm close to it.
Right.
So my view is that as long as that continues, Australia will never have a manufacturing sector of any significance. And I note in the US, J.D. Vance from the former industrial state of Ohio and Donald Trump, they are pro rebuilding a tariff wall in the United States, like Abraham Lincoln, like William McKinley.
Right. Yeah.
You think that's a bad idea?
Well, I just
Assume,
don't see why. I mean, there are reasons. Obviously, there are reasons to. Sometimes we want, for security reasons, we want to cultivate an industry. In which case, direct subsidies would be the way to go to that industry. I guess we're getting a bit of that with respect to the rare earths now. Direct transfers to these industries in some ways, though they may be ill-shapen, would probably be the much better way to go than just tariffs. Tariffs are such an excuse for bad policy. It seems to me they might have sometimes elevated motives, but they'll be hijacked by venal motives and produce little. So and finally, if I could say, I don't believe that Australia will ever produce no manufacturers. Rather, it's niche manufacturers, right? Niche manufacturers for Australia conditions, right? So we still have a truck assembler, I think, in Queensland, as I call it. I don't think it actually makes the engines, but it sort of assembles trucks. Well, that's not surprising, right? Australia's has a huge demand for trucks under tough conditions. So, yeah, niche manufacturing will survive in Australia. And I think that's best for all Australians. I guess to fling it back to you, Dan, I don't see any merit in manufacturing as such in the abstract.
Well, I put it this way, and I've had discussions. And I'm a China guy, right? I spent 15 years up there, more or less, so I've seen it change over time. And I recall an anecdote I often use. I recall an Australia Day lunch in Hong Kong where
Yeah,
Peter Costello, Hong Treasure, who I
yes,
think you're related to, right? Yeah, or indirectly, yeah.
yeah.
He said, regaling us all, that he meets these Americans and it's crazy the way they don't understand economics. I mean, they tell me they worry that China will produce all of America's automobiles. And he said words to the effect that, look, it doesn't matter if China produces all of America's automobiles. And I just thought at that time, does it really not matter if China produces all the automobiles for the United
Well,
States? Doesn't a nation have to have a certain base industrial capacity for its? Otherwise, it becomes very, very vulnerable to all sorts of pressures and
well, hang on. If you're
contingencies.
making a national security reference, I'd agree with you. I mean, in a national security sense, the United States and any larger country would be well advised to be able to make vehicles. But your thought seems to be there's a kind of broader merit than just the national security reference in manufacturing, and I think that's where we disagree.
Then my point would be this: that a couple of points. It's very hard to simply select which narrow defense-related industries are going to be useful in the future. But also, if you were ever to go to war with China or anyone else, what's the point in having whiz-bang quantum computing technology or critical minerals refining if you can't get toothpaste, toothbrushes, light bulbs, shoes, shirts, wiring, everything else? I mean, it's unrealistic to think that is a proper way to sort of fortify yourself. And it also it lacks a bit of commercial reality, because future innovations typically come from a broader industrial ecosystem. They're not sort of where people are tinkering away in the suburbs of Detroit or whatever else, and talking about how they can improve the cars, and from that they understand about how have a lot better idea about how to build a tank. And so this idea that we can just focus on a few narrow national security things and then have China outs base or anyone else outsource produce everything else. I just don't think. I think it's. I think there's some flawed thinking in that approach.
Well, there's something in what you're saying, but you must
Mm.
remember there's the power of adaptation. At the outbreak of the Second World War, it was discovered that Australia produced no cardboard, right? Well, we ended up making cardboard, right? I mean, it wasn't beyond Australia to manufacture cardboard to satisfy its own requirements. I mean, World War II in Australia is an example of many things where we started making it ourselves. So I think that should be kept in mind. But I think your point is a reasonable one. I mean, one could imagine an economy which almost imported every tangible good, and just say just produced sort of intellectual services, and otherwise imported every tangible good. That I guess that would have a defence. That would have a national security issue in such a strange economy. But again, I think subsidies rather than tariffs would be the way to go.
Okay. Well, more broadly, I mean, you sort of finish your book. I think somewhat sort of whimsically thinking that it might be been better if in the future we get away from the nation state and perhaps encourage the polis or city states or something along those lines to develop. Is that what your preference is, really? And is that realistic too? To think
it was just the way of ending it. Look, it just seems to me that in Australia the only pride I see, well, I'm exaggerating, is a pride in polis, right? So Melburnians, Sydneyans, and so on. It seems Australian pride is very weak. The United States seems identities are based around cities, really, rather than anything larger. So that's something, and also animosities, right? So it seems that the United Kingdom is divided between Londoners and non-Londoners, right? And each just holds the other in disdain. So yeah, I think it may be that these megapolises are just becoming the source of people's identity, and that may be one reason for thinking that political structures should be built around it. But I just see otherwise national feeling, a genuine national feeling, just fading almost everywhere. Certain countries which were used to flag waving, such as the United States. I'm not living in the United States. I just have a feeling that it's just fading. So what are we going to build? What solidarity are we going to build political structures around? Seems the nation is no longer such a solidarity.
See, because I lived in Hong Kong and saw that little free market city state essentially be taken over by a larger nation state, I am skeptical that individual city states are good for the long haul.
I think that's a great retort, but I could retort in turn by invoking Singapore, right? Which was a place which, when it became independent, was really forced out of the Malaysian Federation in the early 60s. Everybody thought it couldn't make it, right? That little, place. In fact, Singapore is now, well, it's a superpower, but it's been very reputable for many years. And it's going, none of its surrounding powers are going to mix with Singapore's sovereignty. So, yeah, I guess it comes back to circumstances. It depends.
Yeah, it does, and it's good to have that tension between the it's good to have these debates between the federalists and anti-federalists in
Yeah.
their modern version. But and there's some, obviously, there's historical times where you had great intellectual dynamism with competing city states in, I don't know, Medici Italy, and even in China and elsewhere.
Yeah.
But the nation state, you say it's on the wane, but hasn't it? Isn't it better to think that we should be, rejuvenating it, because it is, with its flaws, overly centralized. It has proven the best way of protecting people's
Well,
people and their prosperity going forward.
well, I think you use this term nation state. Why not just state? I think that the nation is very undefined in this discussion. Why do you call India a nation state? Indians see themselves that way. It seems that um, um, yeah, I just think we should just why not just use the term state? What is nation adding here to you?
Well, there's no. I was just thinking. There's no. Well, a people are. This is the other thing that I think is somewhat missed in your book, but obviously you can only cover so much. The late 19th century was full of nationalist movements, right? The
Yeah,
Hungarians, the Irish, the
yeah,
Zionism,
yes, yes,
and they were. They had a sense of being a people and a nation
yeah,
before
yeah,
they
yeah,
established a state.
yeah, yeah,
And in a way, I think Australia did too. We were, yes, I think
yeah.
you have in your book, we all raised the British flag, but I feel we were Australian Britons, and there was, to use I think a term John S. Mill used to use, there was fellow feeling between someone in Brisbane and someone in Perth. Yes, they had
Well,
local parochialisms, but there was still, in the same way today. Yes, whatever, proud Queenslander and the rest of it, but I go to Perth and hang out with those Western Australians or Adelaide, and I'm proud of
yeah,
their
yeah,
achievements in the Olympics. I'm proud of
yeah,
this, that, and the other. So aren't we
yeah.
a nation in that sense,
Look,
even if it's not formalized?
the sense of Australian identity, as I said, goes way back to the 19th century, right?
Mm.
But the creation of the federation was not propelled in the first place by such identities. On the contrary, it was propelled by Britannicism and what I'd call Celtism or Hibernianism. Britannicism, we're going to build a new Britain under the Southern Stars.
Mm.
Celtism or Hibernianism, we're going to build a new island under these Southern Stars. Genuinely Australian sentiment was third fiddle to those two sentiments. The first, so very obvious in Henry Parkes, Britannicism. The second, so very, very obvious in Cardinal Moran, the eminent Catholic cleric of the day. So I don't believe federation was born of, in any way, of some pre-existing Australian identity. And in fact, this comes back to your point, can't we make the nation state stronger? I think federalism was harmful to the creation of Australian identity because what it paved the way for was a kind of resurgent Britannicism. So in the first, isn't it ironic? Not only as you sort of pointed out, was the Union Jack raised at the opening of the first Parliament throughout Australia. Throughout that first decade of the 20th century, the leading political partisans became presidents of British Empire bodies. George Reed became president of was it called the Empire Union, while Deakin became president of the Imperial Federation League. We had this strange neo-Britannicism bursting out rather than an Australianism. I
But
find it quite,
the context.
yeah.
Sorry, it was just
Well,
the thing is that the context is important, because I don't think, and I don't think people quite understand in this day and age, that end of the 19th century, Britain had a problem, the colonies had a problem. The colonies were, wanting to be more independent and assert themselves, impose tariffs. but they still relied on Britain for a large part for their defense. And Britain had seen this story before with the Americans, right? And they wanted to work out how you could probably incorporate these colonies, which they were very friendly, and not lose them, because if you lose them, that's a detriment to Britain as well. And so they were the discussions that were swirling around at that time. And wasn't it in the end, given the sort of potential ways it could have gone off the rails, not a bad solution? You get these Australian, a new nation in being, or state, or however you want to describe it, a formalized state, a nation I think already existed, and you have a strong ties with the UK. Everyone's still proud of the mother country and ready to go to war if necessary to protect the interests of the empire, but developing a more maturity as a society, as a nation, and understanding that we will forge our own path, as we ended up doing.
But we're already responsible government came to almost all of Australia in 1856, right? We're already governing ourselves, defending our, not to some degree, and the Royal Navy was sort of rented to stay in Garden Island in Sydney, but in landfall sense, defending ourselves. So there already was 6, self-governing societies on the Australian continent. I don't see any of the things you mentioned as requiring the creation of the federal structure we ended up getting. At least, not such an overbearing one. Anyway, yeah.
I don't know. Isn't there at some level, in the human heart, a wanting to be part of a nation? Lives there a man with soul so dead that never to his heart. It's my native land, and I am a Scot or an Australian, and you don't want to be just, you either, yes, I'm a Queenslander, but it's not a nation, because what I share with Queenslanders is more narrow than what I share with people from Victoria and Tasmania and everything else. And
there might be that. Look, I'm not denying that psychology might well exist. It seems to be there's a kind of population of persons who you sort of share the most important things with, some sense like that. And that creates the nation. That may well be, but I guess what's the question? You think that's Australia wide? I don't deny it, but I have a number of propositions that creating a state, a central state for that group, is not necessarily a good idea at all. It may be useful for foreign affairs and defence, but for anything else, localism and competition would be far more productive of good things. That would be my contention. We don't need the federal government to be building bicycle paths. I mean, for heaven's sakes, it's just a sort of madness. But that's what we've got.
You have, and it's very interesting, the descriptions of our founders, Edmund Barton and Alfred Deakin and George Reed and all the rest of them. And I couldn't help but think, contrast your warts and all description with the often hagiographic treatment that the American founders receive. George Washington cannot tell a lie about cutting the cherry tree.
Yes.
Do you have the same view? Yeah. Do you have the same view of the American founders as the Australian ones, or do you just
without wanting to
get it the same way?
I mean, obviously, Deakin was a very intelligent man. I'm not saying George Reed was an intelligent man, though he was less showy about it than say Deakin. Um, Henry Parkes was a very capable a man, though I think he had all sorts of policy, personal defects. I don't think there's any reason we should cringe at the very most senior level of our federal leaders. But in terms of thinking about the political situation, it's just not to be compared to the Americans. I'm not saying George Washington was a thinker, but Jefferson and Mason and Hamilton, these people were thought really hard about their political situation in a way which just is completely alien to Australia's much less urgent situation. Yeah, it was, as Benjamin Franklin said, if we'll either stick together or hang separately. And the prospect of hanging concentrates the mind. There was just such an urgency about the American situation that I think that brought out the very best in their talents, while the Australian situation was so much less urgent. Just mediocrity seemed to prevail. Does that respond to what you're saying?
Well, I guess it was also a different age, right? The age of enlightenment was,
yeah.
and the Americans were doing it for the first time. It was the first major separation. They had to justify themselves before, God and man about why they were doing it the way they were doing it. And there's various differences. They were talented guys. I mean, Alexander Hamilton, I think, is someone still worth reading about, and the debates that they had are very, very relevant, both in discussions about nation forming and governance and everything else. But their constitution wasn't perfect either. I mean, they had some, obviously slavery. The Senate, I still think, is odd. The drama doesn't. The Congress doesn't have any of the drama of the House of Commons or even our federal parliament.
Well, that's because that's been well noted for almost centuries. And the obvious answer is that there are no ministers in the House of Representatives, right? So, in a sense, powerful people aren't there. So
the
it sort of lacks
the ability to get rid of a president is very difficult, and it unlike getting rid of a prime minister, where we just sort of he or she can lose their position, within a day, effectively, or in theory on the floor of the parliament, whereas the Americans take forever to get rid of a president, and
well, that's
hard to do. But anyway, so their system, despite great minds, wasn't perfect, isn't perfect either. I guess just to sort of finish up, and I really enjoyed the discussion. I mean, if again, there is this new wave, right? I think you see it in the United States, you see it in Europe, less so in Australia probably than anywhere else for now. This reassertance of the importance of the nation and issues like immigration and trade, which define. You can have arguments about they're good or bad, but define what type of industry a nation should have, what type of people a nation should have, and they are being reassessed. I think it's fair to say, certainly in the United States, but elsewhere in Europe. Given your knowledge about federation and how it played out, I think it's actually a very similar time to the late 19th century.
Really?
How? Well, I think there are similarities that you can draw, and that's why I'm interested in talking to you about it, and that's why I'm kind of interested in this area. But what what in your view would be the antidote to that? Because you're not that keen on the solutions that were adopted at Australian Federation. So what you think it's just there needs to be a more an invocation of liberalism generally to get people to be
an antidote to what?
I don't know. No, an antidote to an antidote to what I think a kind of some of the policy prescriptions in immigration and trade, which you think at Federation harmed Australia, and I guess harmed the United States and others that adopted it around the same time. What? what would be your policy prescription at the moment to counter this this new movement that is focusing on trade restrictions, immigration restrictions, and rebuilding a sense of nationhood, both in Australia, Europe, and elsewhere?
Well, I think you've pitched me as an adversary of some of these causes, and I don't see myself as squarely the adversary. I mean, obviously, the collapse of the American border is just a scandal. The collapse of the basic function of government to keep its borders, and I'll be the first person to support the re-establishment of that border. Though I don't speak as an American, obviously, but so I don't see myself as an adversary of many of these impulses. I mean, I guess as a non-Briton, I too favoured Brexit would be a good idea for Britain. But I certainly wouldn't support Brexit if it. Well, certainly would. My support would be diminished if it was just a matter of putting around futile and destructive tariff walls around Britain. I mean, the point of Brexit to me is it's a sovereignty argument to allow Britain to make laws for itself. And yes, going with that is a possibility of making silly laws, but I don't therefore believe in silly laws. So I think I believe that that the attempt to try to get to our point of disagreement, which is on tariffs, I believe that the attempt to revive tariffs will be disappointed, partly because because the manufacturing sector everywhere is so much less important than it once was. It just won't have the political muscle to pull, certainly not in Australia, and I think elsewhere. We are in the age of services, and so manufacturing will never have the pull on policy which it ever will. So in a sense, I'm not that anxious about trade policy. But if you're asking me how do people, liberal market economists, persuade people of the benefits of liberal market policies, well, I think it's just very difficult to persuade them, and it's really events which produce free markets, not Adam Smith, which produced the abolition of the Corn Laws in 1846. It was a famine. So people like me rather just wait on events to produce free market policies, I have to say.
I noticed Donald Trump recently said that tariffs are the greatest thing ever invented in Michigan, and I could just very well imagine the hawk eating Howard Eric eyes pulling their hair out at things like that.
Yeah.
But we will certainly see how the events unfold in the US and elsewhere. It's been a pleasure chatting. Where can people, if they want to find out more about your work,
right? Well, thanks, Dan. I do have a website which is called William Oliver, my middle name, WilliamOliverColeman.com. So you can Google that and you can find out more about it. The book on Federation, the Fiery Cross of Union, is on you buy it from the website, the Connor Court website. People know about Connor Court. So yeah, I think there are two leads for people. Yeah. And I've got a book coming out soon with Connor Court.
And you're working on another book.
Roberts.
That's right, another one.
The great anti-federationist leader. So you can see one thing's leading to another. So yeah, watch out for that.
Got it. We may have to talk again on that when that finally comes out. Like I said, great to chat to you, and look forward to catching up again in future. Thanks again, William.
Thank you very much, Dan.